Goat versus fish. In the beginning, there was goat versus fish, the GoatVsFish. And goat versus fish said that there should be goat and that there should be fish. There is no alpha or omega. There is no black or white. There is no good or evil. There is only goat and fish. And goat versus fish. Welcome to the Goat vs. Fish podcast, recorded within Goat vs. Fish, recorded deep within Goat vs. Fish. Goat vs. Fish speaks to you now, speaks directly to you. Adult Swim Festiversus, Adult Swim. Goat vs. Fish brought verses to the 1st Adult Swim Festiversus. Celebration. Amazing, excellent, fun, and mighty verses of much frolicking goat and swimming fish, and so many verses within the Festiversus. But there is one verses that verses out from all other verses. This verses. It has been a very long verses of Goat vs. Fish, a very familiar verses of Goat vs. Fish, in which there has at long verses been triumph at the Adult Swim Festiversus. But what of these verses? Now, goat and fish are always saying to Goat vs. Fish, "I like your hat," or "It is the king," and verses such as these. Goat vs. Fish has never claimed to be a king. And as for hats, well, Goat vs. Fish knows of the ones that are Goat vs. Fish. But what is this kingly verses? The Goat vs. Fish does not understand the ones when they are trying to perceive Goat vs. Fish. But Goat vs. Fish has at long verses understood these sounds of the ones, and so we shall call it Verses of the Crown, verses of the Crown, verses of the Crown, verses of the Crown. Now, Goat vs. Fish does not seek to be misversed. There is no crown. There is only goat and fish, and Goat vs. Fish. What you are calling the crown of Goat vs. Fish is not a crown, but simply Goat vs. Fish. It is Goat vs. Fish. It is part of Goat vs. Fish. It is a mighty verses. It is. Goat vs. Fish must say, it is a verses that many ones are yet to comprehend of Goat vs. Fish, though some of you goat and fish do. Perhaps you do. Perhaps you, one who listens, does understand these verses. But Goat vs. Fish shall call it the verses of the crown, but only for the pleasantness of the goat and fish to understand in some verses the splendorousness of Goat vs. Fish. And it was written that the verses of the crown was a long and mighty verses very close to Goat vs. Fish. And it was written that goat and fish verses most goat and fishily in the verses of the crown. But in one verses, when Goat vs. Fish was speaking to the ones, and saying that it was Goat vs. Fish, a pointy one pointed to Goat vs. Fish, pointing out in saying, "But it only says goat versus. Where is the fish? Where was the fish? Where was the fish? What happened to fish?" The fish had left the verses of the crown. Some say it had fallen off the verses. But in any verses, it was so that on the verses of the crown, it said goat, verses, and no fish. It seemed the fish had at long verses been triumphed by goat, at this the verses of Adult Swim, such a sea of swimming fish. And it was written that Goat did triumph in the verses of the crown. Celebration for Goat, celebration for Goat. The goat, the goat, the goat do triumph. The goat do triumph over the fish. The goat, the goat, the goat do triumph. The goat do triumph over the fish. Goat versus Fish was so celebrating with Goat, but what of the fish? Goat versus Fish did despair. Goat versus Fish did despair. Was the fish lost for all verses? This fishiest of fish? Yet Goat versus Fish did not despair for long, for the longer you wait to seize the verses, the further from you it becomes. Unless it is a verses that is moving towards you, but in any verses, Goat versus Fish knew it was to seek that fish at this very verses. But where to seek the fish? Where to seek the fish? And just at that verses, even goat that had triumphed, so celebrating in its celebration of triumph, did stop to help, to seek the fish. Why not look upon the land, said the goat. This goat does triumph over the fish on the land, claimed the goat. You should seek that fish on the land. It was wise verses from that goat, wise verses from that goat. So Goat versus Fish and the goat frolicked across the land, looking, questing, searching for a shimmering fish. And there, shining in the verses, not 20 verses from Goat versus Fish, it was the fish, ooh, the fish. Goat versus Fish did find the fish, with the help of Goat. The fish, the triumphed fish, was once again one with Goat versus Fish. And yes, Goat was pleased to see its fishy former verses are safe and unended, though it did gloat as a goat over the fish for its triumph, of course. Goat versus Fish kept the fish within Goat versus Fish, and did, for that verses, retire the verses of the crown for what was still to come of the Adult Swim Festiversus, and for the remainder of the verses, and still even now, until Fish is ready to verses for the crown again. Where was that verses? Now it is Goat. Now it is Goat, Goat, Goat. And you can see that goat on the Goat versus Fish Instantgram at GoatVsFish at GoatVsFish. Celebration for Goat, that does triumph in the verses of the crown. Who is goat and who is fish? Goat versus Fish was frolicking to the musically celebrations of one high on fire, when a motley one carrying sweet verses of consumption, watermelon, it is of the sea, happened upon Goat versus Fish. Goat and Fish mistook this for an offering to Goat versus Fish, and began to verses for it. Now on one verses, Goat versus Fish wished to tell Goat and Fish that this verses was not an offering that was made, and to respect the consumption of the one. But on the other verses, Goat versus Fish enjoys to see Goat and Fish verses for any verses, and so did this one enjoy to witness Goat and Fish. This one was called Pooh Stew, and you can find it chattily chatting away on the Adult Swim living streams. Are you goat or are you fish? And the one called Pooh Stew was a goat. It was a goat. A high goat, a very high goat, enjoying the grass of the land, such as it did. And there was Goat Pooh Stew and Goat versus Fish, rollicking in dancilatory high-on-fire celebrations. It was witnessed by many goat and fish. And this goat, Itso versus, was most friendsome with many of the ones at Adult Swim, the place of Fishcenter life. Come with this goat, said the Pooh Goat Stew, and let us find other goat and fish. making to the other side of the verses to watch the Morty and Rick musical prick experience, GoatVsFish happened upon one called Rainbow Unicorn Poop. Much poo verses, this verses, much poo verses. But is Rainbow Unicorn Poop goat or fish? It is a fish, it is a fish. It is a one-horned poopful fish. Beware the unicorn fish, goat. It has fins and horns and full of poo fish. The verses of Rainbow Unicorn Poos to the verses of Rainbow Unicorn Poos to. And that verses continues even now, for that fish is also in the Adult Swim living streams, often versing with the Poos to goat. Now, that Rainbow Unicorn Poop fish at Nicole from Texas on the Instantgram regaled GoatVsFish with its own splendid verses, for it is to be developing some contented verses of its own with Adult Swim. Enticing verses. But that is all that was written, for it could not say more to GoatVsFish. It could say no more. It does seem that the Adult Swim, being a sea of fish, has some tidings over this fish. It is secret verses. Atop the Rainbow Unicorn Poop fish was a hatfish of Adult Swim, with many Adult Swimmers' callings written upon it. "Can we trade hats?" said the fish to GoatVsFish. Now, by this verses, it was goat that was upon GoatVsFish, in celebration of the triumph of goat in the verses of the crown that GoatVsFish had just told you of. And the goat upon GoatVsFish heard that the Rainbow Unicorn Poop fish wanted to verses. It leapt from GoatVsFish, leaving the verses open for a fish to triumph. Fish was back in the verses. For 10 or 20 verses, it was all fish upon GoatVsFish. The evidence is on the Instantgram. Oh, it is on the Instantgram, and it was written. Celebration fish, you did not give up the verses. Though goat did triumph in the verses of the crown. The fish continued to verses, and had some triumphs of its very own. Goat, realizing what had verses, returned to GoatVsFish, and then the fish back to fish, and the verses continues. It was a Festiversus, yes, and the celebration all up in the ones. Poos to Goat introduced GoatVsFish to one that GoatVsFish had encountered at the lands and seas of the Adult Swim State Park at the verses of Comic Con. It was the conductor of the Bingo Verses, in which GoatVsFish did achieve what the ones call bingo and received many tchotchke-sum offerings from Adult Swim. It was called Nick Gibbons at Nick Gibbons on the Instantgram, as seen on Adult Swim. And it took a verses for it to recognize GoatVsFish. So many ones it does see, it did claim. But is it goat or fish? After a brief pondering, GoatVsFish suspected that this Nick Gibbons one did remember that it was the Adult Swim of swimming fish. For it was a fish. Celebration for Nick Gibbons fish. Surrounded by so many pleasant goat and fish, GoatVsFish made an offering to the goat and fish to consume what the goat and fish call, what they do call it. Let us see, it is, where are the verses? Where are the verses? Yes, it is. Beer! Yes, it is called beer. A special sea of the fish, for those who do not know. Though some of it is certainly goat, some of it is doppelgoat, that brings out the celebration in any fish or goat, brings out the celebration and the verses as well. GoatVsFish did ask. For the Ron Oster one of Tim and Eric's awesome verses had just been on the GoatVsFish podcast in the previous verses from this verses. Perhaps another fish from Adult Swim would be willing to join GoatVsFish? And oh yes, Nick Fish Gibbons even did say it wished and would appear on the GoatVsFish podcast at the Comedy Store Los Angeles. Shall it be written? Shall it be written? We shall see if it is. As seen on, we shall see what it is. But for even now, Fish Nick Gibbons, it is on the GoatVsFish Instantgram. An evidence of another Adult Swim fish, a proud fish, for you to like. After the Rickle-Pick musical experience, GoatVsFish sought new goat and fish. And there at the celebration was another familiar one that twice did cross verses with GoatVsFish. It was called One Sally Maybe at Sally Maybe on the Instantgram. Oh, it recognized GoatVsFish. It recognized GoatVsFish. It even follows GoatVsFish. For one, Sally Maybe is of the Adult Swim living streams of stupid morning bullshit, in which GoatVsFish did appear in the Comic Con verses for all to see and hear and behold. It was a busy one, but remained pleasant to GoatVsFish all throughout the verses. But was it goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? Sally Maybe goat? Sally Maybe fish? But it was a goat. It was a goat! Within the living streams of the Adult Swim fish, it was a goat! And how incredulous it was to hear that Nick Gibbons was a fish. GoatVsFish does censor verses. It was now for a visage with this new stupid bullshit morning goat, and a visage was taken. GoatVsFish always wishes goat and fish to be comfortable with GoatVsFish and even their own visages. The fence sitter is, of course, too uncomfortable to be comforted by GoatVsFish unless it chooses goat or fish. But this was a goat. This was a goat that could be comfortable with GoatVsFish, and that goat looked upon its own visage. My eyes, not my eyes, cried the bullshit goat, looking upon its own sears of GoatVsFish within the visage. And so, to disguise its very goat, perhaps to be hiding from all the Adult Swim fish, not yet knowing it had revealed goat, covered its very sears. It became a shady bullshit goat right within the streams of the Adult Swim fish. Beware fish, beware fish. GoatVsFish is finding that even within Adult Swim, there are many goat. There are many goat. More goat than you may suspect as a fish. Transition. There were so many goat and fish, and even fence-sitters at that verses. The fence-sitter that is usually with GoatVsFish even lost its verses, and at the long verses simply was ready to listen to GoatVsFish without making more noisily noises, pointing out points to GoatVsFish. Listen to it now. Listen to that fence-sitter now. It has nothing to say to GoatVsFish. I am so sorry, fence-sitter. I am so sorry, fence-sitter, but it seems that you will simply have to choose goat or fish now. You will have to choose goat or fish. Fence-sitter, you have nothing to say to GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish cannot even hear this, fence-sitter. What is it you are trying to communicate to GoatVsFish? More fenciness? More about how there is some other thing that is not a goat or a fish? What? GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish cannot... Is this so? Is this so, fence-sitter? Truly? It seems that there is some fenciness in this fence-sitter! That still remains GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish did not know this for 2 whole verses. This fence-sitter has not made a verses to GoatVsFish, but now... It seems there is some fenciness left still in this fence-sitter, and even without that fence-sitter, listen to this. There is another fence-sitter, GoatVsFish thought with the silence of that fence-sitter that some do call a... GoatVsFish does not even wish to say it, a pirate chicken, that it was the end of the fenciness, but now the fence-sitter continues to make the sound of the fence-sitter to GoatVsFish, and this other fence-sitter making its own... GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish was not expecting these verses. GoatVsFish. 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 In with GoatVsFish. Out with GoatVsFish. It is GoatVsFish. There will always be fence-sitters. That is until they all choose goat or fish. And they will all choose goat or fish. No fences about it. Speaking of fenciness, and the so many ones to speak of, there was a mighty one that was called Blackman at Blackman Empowers on the Instantgram. That was pleased to see GoatVsFish, and GoatVsFish was pleased to see that one. GoatVsFish cannot recall now if that one black man is goat or if it is fish. For it is somewhat fancy to GoatVsFish, as you well know the verses, that there is no black or white, and that there is only goat and fish. And at least in those verses with GoatVsFish, the black man one appreciated these verses of GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish hopes to verses with that one again, to again ask it the one true question. And it seems it should be so. It seems it should be so, for both the black man, goat or fish, and GoatVsFish appeared on a verses of L.A. Weekly. Oh yes, on the line verses of L.A. Weekly, referring to the ones who came to the Adult Swim Festiversus as a swarm of fans, or some fanciness. The L.A. Weekly verses are called Adult Swim Fans Swarm Inaugural Festive. All. Of course, GoatVsFish is GoatVsFish, and the ones are, as usual verses, calling one another many things that are not goat or fish. But GoatVsFish thanks the one Scott Feinblatt for those verses, be it goat or be it fish. Or even if it is a fence-sitter. GoatVsFish appeared briefly on the living stream Dear Jono. But the speaking verses of GoatVsFish were fenced out of the verses. Still, celebration. That suspected fence-sitter Dear Jono one was asking the ones a peculiar verses, asking what was the verses? Ah yes, what is your biggest complaint about these verses, about the Adult Swim Festiversus? Yes, what is your biggest complaint? And GoatVsFish simply asked it. What is your biggest complaint about GoatVsFish? For it is all GoatVsFish. It is all GoatVsFish. The Dear Jono GoatVsFish streams of the October 8th stream. The October 8th stream of Dear Jono. Celebration for GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish has now been on 3 Adult Swim living streams. The Fishcenter Live, Stupid Morning Bullshit, and Dear Jono, are you goat or are you fish? And speaking of the Fishcenter Live, on the verses of October 9th, GoatVsFish did call into Fishcenter Live. For the chattily chat ones were speaking of GoatVsFish and the wonders of GoatVsFish from the Adult Swim Festiverses. And the Fishcenter Live on the Twitter did reverses GoatVsFish from the Adult Swim Festiverses, as you should, supporting GoatVsFish, supporting Fishcenter Live. But the verses that you can perhaps listen to and watching to even now was strange verses for GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish was expecting more speaking of fish. It is Fishcenter Live. It is Fishcenter Live. GoatVsFish wanted to speak of the fish. Any fish, all the fish. Needing a go-to verses, needing a go-to verses. But it was some fence-sitterly verses about what is being called a cat that is already calling itself not a goat or a fish, and then it is calling itself yet some other verses, a nicknaming verses. What are these verses? Perhaps next Fishcenter Lively verses, GoatVsFish will not be so accommodating to the fenciness. But GoatVsFish, of course, thanks Fishcenter Live for sounding the verses of GoatVsFish. All across the ones. GoatVsFish must now mention goats Dr. Joss at Dr. Joss and Kelly Green at Find Kelly Green, who are always bringing new ones to hear the verses of GoatVsFish whenever they are at the Festiversus. Thank you, goats. Thank you, goats. Thank you, goats. And also to Goat Lucien of Ocel, who went hoof to fence with quite a fancy fence-sitter, who, GoatVsFish does their verses, knew only fences about GoatVsFish, in spite of the many verses. Thank you to all the Goat and Fish, and the Adult Swim Festiversus for welcoming GoatVsFish. So many splendid goat and fish at the Adult Swim verses. So many more that now follow GoatVsFish and do know the verses of GoatVsFish. Or perhaps they simply recognize GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish prognosticates excellent verses to come. Excellent verses to come for GoatVsFish and for all goat and fish. Thanks to you. Thanks to you! For GoatVsFish does come from within you. Does come from within you, goat and fish. You are the ones who spread the verses of GoatVsFish. You are the ones who are sharing and reversing GoatVsFish. You are the ones who are asking the ones that you know if they are goat or fish, and you create GoatVsFish. You create GoatVsFish. Perhaps one versus GoatVsFish will even be having a living stream on the Adult Swim, but we shall have to see about those verses. For now, it shall be GoatVsFish. It shall be GoatVsFish. But GoatVsFish does have some mixed verses to share with you now. Next verses shall be another verses of the GoatVsFish podcast from the Comedy Store Los Angeles with one Stuart Strauss of Twin Peaks of the Land verses. And that is Celebration. But following that verses, the GoatVsFish podcast shall be every other Wednesday verses instead of every Wednesday verses. GoatVsFish is so pleased with the GoatVsFish podcast, and all of you who do listen. It is simply that it takes many verses to bring you the verses of the GoatVsFish podcast. GoatVsFish reaches you, yes. But do you remember your first verses? Before you knew of GoatVsFish, and then came to you GoatVsFish? Before you knew if you are goat or fish? There are so many now, so many still now, who have not heard the verses of GoatVsFish, who have not even seen a visage of GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish must goat to them now. GoatVsFish must fish to them now. GoatVsFish must verses with them now. Must communicate with them. Must communicate with the ones. Spread the verses of GoatVsFish at the comedy places and the Festiversus. The ones must see GoatVsFish. They must feel GoatVsFish. They must come to know GoatVsFish. And then they can be told to hear the verses of GoatVsFish on the GoatVsFish podcast and follow all the verses on the Twitterver, on the Book of Faces, on the Instantgram. GoatVsFish wishes to speak to those ones. Perhaps as GoatVsFish has once spoken to you. And so there shall be less GoatVsFish podcast, and more frolicking and swimming about the lands and seas, seeking goat and fish. For it will be GoatVsFish. It will be GoatVsFish. GoatVsFish is thinking about future verses now, but if you wish to know where it is to be appearing GoatVsFish, simply go, as always, to GoatVsFish.com to see dates and times of all future verses. And even though it shall be every other verses, please do rate and review the GoatVsFish podcast on the Ite-Oons and the Spotify. GoatVsFish shall be going out to the land and the sea, oh yes. And when you are out in the land and the sea, look about you, look about you. Find one who is lost, just as does GoatVsFish. Find one who does not know the way, just as does GoatVsFish. And ask, simply ask, are you goat or are you fish? Are you goat or fish? Are you goat or fish? These are the verses of GoatVsFish. I am GoatVsFish, the goatfish. And now for a celebration, though this has all been a celebration of the Adult Swim Festiversus. The sounds of the reversist celebration of Fishcenter Live, to be found as pinned verses on the GoatVsFish Twitterver. Go and reverses those verses, spread the verses of GoatVsFish, but for now, imagine the fish, the glorious, beautiful Fishcenter fish questing for verses, searching for goat at the Adult Swim Festival. Celebration! You can do it, fish! You can do it, fish! The verses are yours if you only can go for the verses! Go for the verses! Verses! Oh, it is the fish! It is the fish of Fishcenter Live! Perhaps some of these fish are no more, but there are fish, and they are ready to verses goat. They leave these verses, they say there are no goat here. Where are the goats? They seek other verses. GoatVsFish sees you, Adult Swim. GoatVsFish sees you, face of swimming fish. Do you see GoatVsFish? And it was written. And it was written. Absolutely. It was written. Fun.